It's Monday, January 30th, 1989. 13-year-old Dublin, California teen Ilene Misheloff is walking home from school. She was able to be dismissed a little earlier than her classmates and was enjoying the unseasonably warm day. Somewhere along her 2-mile walk, Ilene would encounter evil. Her family has been left shattered and without answers, moving forward with their lives while living in an endless time loop of unanswered questions. She was one of several young girls to go missing in the East Bay area of California in the late 80s and early 90s. While some of these crimes have been solved, their possible connection to Ilene's disappearance is still unknown. The Dublin Police Department continues to work tirelessly alongside the family to get her name and story out there in an effort to find answers. I want to do the same. This is A Simpler Time True Crime, The Abduction of Ilene Misheloff. Ilene Beth Misheloff and her twin brother Brian were born on March 12, 1975. They joined their 2-year-old brother Robert and parents Michael and Madeline, who goes by Maddie. Her father Mike was from Brooklyn and her mother Maddie from New Jersey. However, they met each other on a chance trip to California. They were both on their respective spring breaks, and Maddie's brother knew Mike from college. He introduced the pair, who really hit it off and began their long-distance romance. Mike was 5 years Maddie's senior. He finished up grad school and moved to Princeton to be closer to Maddie, who was studying biology and medical technology at American University in D.C. In 1971, they were married and moved to Nebraska, where they welcomed their 3 children. Mike fondly referred to them in a Patch.com article as a family of Cornhuskers. When the children were preschool age, they moved to Dublin for work, and that's where they settled to make their home. Dublin is located within the Amador Valley of Alameda County's Tri-Valley region. It has great proximity to popular California cities: 21 miles to Oakland, 26 to San Jose, 28 to San Francisco, and 64 to Sacramento. At the time, it was small and middle class, with about 22,000 residents. It's a wealthier community now, with around 73,000 residents, and from 2010 to 2020 was considered the fastest-growing city in California. Nationwide, it was the 12th fastest-growing city for cities with populations of 50,000 people or more. Ilene was a talented and goal-oriented child. She wanted to become a pediatrician so she could help children when she got older. She was very involved and played flute in the marching band. Her father said, quote, "She was a very determined girl. Once she decided to do something, she would pursue it until she did it." This mindset and work ethic likely led to her success in competitive figure skating. She was already very accomplished and was racking up tons of local medals, practicing 30-plus hours a week at the same rink as Olympian Kristi Yamaguchi. She hoped to take her skating talents and become a coach someday. That rigorous skating schedule earned her PE credits that allowed her to leave school early on certain days when the day was ending with PE. That's what happened on January 30th, 1989. She had a regular morning at home, and her dad dropped her off at school that morning on his way into work in Silicon Valley. She attended all her regularly scheduled classes up until that early dismissal. Ilene departed Wells Middle School around 2:30 p.m. to begin the 2-mile walk home. Her typical routine on these days was to call her mother to let her know she arrived home safely. She then would be picked up by her coaches around 3:30 and head to Dublin, Iceland for skating practice. On this day, Ilene is thought to have taken her usual route home, which included a cut-through behind some businesses and through a park. While she had done this time and again before, on this day, something went terribly wrong. A few wires were crossed early on, leading to a delay in realization that something had actually happened to Ilene. Ilene did not do her usual call to her mother that day to say she was home safely. However, her mom considered that she may have just gone straight to the ice rink herself. The ice rink is only about a mile from the Misheloff residence, and if she went there from school, she simply would have made a left at the intersection of Amador Valley Boulevard and San Ramon Road, instead of turning right towards her house. This did happen sometimes, and Ilene's father Mike would drop her skates and gear off to the rink for her. At 3:30, when the coaches came to pick her up, she was not at her house, but the coaches thought maybe she had something come up and she just hadn't previously communicated this to them. Thus, the coach just headed to practice and carried on. Maddie, thinking she had gone directly to the rink, headed there to pick her up after work. As she saw the crowd of skaters, panic set in when she didn't see Ilene amongst them. The coaches explained that they had gone to the house, but she wasn't home. Clinging to hope for a reasonable explanation, she called the house to make sure Ilene hadn't fallen asleep and missed practice. But she wasn't there. She called her husband at work to see if he had dropped her skates off, but he hadn't. Nobody knew where Ilene was, and Maddie knew she needed to call 911 and have her husband come home urgently. When they got home, Ilene's bag and everything she needed for skating practice was still all in her room ready to go. It hadn't been touched. In a world where we're always one text away from each other, some of this may seem hard to imagine. In today's world, Ilene's check-in would likely be a text to her mother, and her mom wouldn't have hesitated to contact her cell just to double-check if she hadn't heard from her. I imagine the coaches showing up to the house would text Ilene or Maddie nowadays to say, "Hey, we're at your house. Are you coming to practice?" But in 1989, they would have had to look up Maddie's work number on some emergency contact form and make the decision to call her at work for what they chalked up to probably just being a miscommunication about missing practice. So yes, was this pre-cell phone time a simpler time? Sure. Was it a safer time? I don't know. Police and family jumped into action. At this point, hours had already gone by. They were hoping for a less terrifying explanation than what was churning around in their brains at that time. Possibly even that she got injured walking along the trail part of her commute and just needed some help. But in the event that the worst possible scenario had happened, her abductor would already have a huge head start. Police began to scour her walking path, which could have been a few options, but her family and friends believed they knew the exact route she would have taken. I'm going to provide a few maps and images on Instagram about this. Wells Intermediate School is located at 6800 Penn Drive, off of Amador Valley Boulevard. Ilene would have walked up the side street to Amador Valley Boulevard, which is a busy road that goes through Dublin. She would head east on Amador Valley Boulevard and cross over Village Parkway. After that intersection, she would cut through a wide alleyway behind a shopping plaza, including a furniture store called the Sawmill and a bar called Gallagher's Pub, to make her way over to a trail alongside Martin Canyon Creek. This trail wove through John Mape Park, now called Mape Memorial Park, to Nielsen Elementary School. From there, she was just a block from her home. Police searched for witnesses and identified a few classmates who said they saw her walking. The last sightings of her from her classmates were from around 3 p.m. A couple of sources state her last known sighting to be on Amador Valley Parkway and Village Parkway. This would have been the first major intersection on her walk down Amador Valley Parkway, and before ever reaching the shopping center or the park. Another source states that the last sightings of her were around Amador Valley Parkway and San Ramon Road, near the shopping center. This would have placed her much farther along on her walk. It's possible that people just saw her on multiple points along the way, and different sources just cite a different point for the last known point. You see, that's one of the frustrating things about researching Ilene's case. There isn't a ton of public information out there, and the internet sources about it are filled with information that just has slightly different details, and I'll get into those more as I keep discussing it. That night, Ilene's father, Mike, spent 6 hours trekking through the park and along the dry creek bed looking for any signs of his only daughter. As he yelled his daughter's name while shining his flashlight left to right, he would occasionally bump into police officers who were searching the same area. He reluctantly gave up around 2 a.m., deciding to try to sleep for a few hours before resuming his search. Mike later recalled that night in an interview for an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, saying, quote, "I thought, if I'm running into police, I'll just let them be out here because they have a better idea of what to look for than I did. I would have probably screwed up evidence if I found something." End quote. Maddie was unable to sleep that first night. She worried in bed until 3 a.m. when she finally called her father on the East Coast to tell him that his granddaughter was missing. The early investigation yielded very few clues. Scent dogs tracked Ilene to the area behind Gallagher's pub, and then lost the scent, presumably meaning this could have been the site of the abduction. However, sometime during the initial searches, Ilene's keychain was recovered near the entranceway of the park, which led investigators to believe the abduction may have happened further along than just behind Gallagher's pub. The layout of John Mate Park is a little interesting, and I'll include a couple of Google Maps images on our Instagram so you can see what I'm talking about. There are a couple of different places that could be considered entrances to the park, and none of the source material I could find, even the FBI website, states where exactly this keychain was found dropped. The first is the main entrance to the park. This is along Mape Way and is not really a parking lot at all, and you wouldn't even probably consider it an entrance if you saw it. It's just a large open area that has a sidewalk that wraps around the park. This would have been where Ilene was exiting the park to head to her house. The other entrance to the park is known more to locals as the back way into the park. However, this area does have a little bit of a parking lot that's adjacent to it, and this would have been where Ilene entered the park. When I look at both of these, the layout of this second area appears to be more of a space where someone could lie in wait. It has kind of an eerie appearance to me on Google Maps, but that just might be my bias because I know something has happened there. One thing that isn't clarified in any material is just exactly when the keychain was found. Was it the first night, the first couple of days? It's hard to tell, and the same goes for the next piece of evidence that was found. Ilene's blue backpack was found in John Mate Park in the dry creek bed. The timeline of this isn't shared either, however, investigators go as far to say as this was in the weeks following an extensive search of the creek bed. They were confident enough in how it was found and how thorough their search of the creek bed had been that they went on record saying they felt it was placed there at a later date. One thing they don't go into saying is what was found in the backpack, if there was anything like fingerprints or, there really couldn't have been DNA evidence identified at the time just with where they were with technology, but it's never been released even to this day if there was anything that had evidentiary value found related to that backpack. Ilene's father tried to pull together resources. He set up an office for himself and local volunteers who mailed out flyers across the state and country. Maddie kept vigil by the landline phone. She would later tell reporters that she was unable to leave the house for 4 weeks, thinking, quote, "If she calls, I have to be here. It was hard," end quote. Given the circumstances of the disappearance, authorities and Ilene's family and friends came to the realization that the worst had happened. Ilene had been abducted on her walk home from school. This shook up the quiet community of Dublin. The familiar saying was floating around in the panicked neighborhoods. Things like, "This kind of thing doesn't happen around here." This most recent disappearance struck a nerve for the greater East Bay area, where residents were piecing together a terrifying pattern. Little girls were going missing, and Ilene was the third in 7 months, and she would not be the last. On June 3rd, 1988, 7-year-old Amber Jean Schwartz Garcia was playing outside of her home on Savage Avenue in Pinole, California. She normally was not allowed to play outside alone, but her mother made an exception this day because the neighbors would be returning soon. She was last seen jumping rope in the front yard. When her mother came out 15 minutes later to look for her, Amber was gone along with her jump rope. She has never been seen again. However, in the weeks after the initial searches for her, a pair of pink socks was found near her house. They were located on top of a baseball diamond near a creek that flows behind her house. This area was searched extensively and, like in Ilene's case, the investigators said they felt the socks were placed there after the fact. Amber has never been located. On November 19th, 1988, 9-year-old Michaela Joy Garrick and her friend rode their scooters to the Rainbow Market on Mission Boulevard in Hayward, California. They went inside with their few dollars and purchased snacks, candy, and soda. They walked outside and began walking home, remembering suddenly that they left their scooters at the market. Going back to retrieve them, they noticed only one scooter was there where they had left them. The other scooter looked like it had been moved and was propped up near a car. When Michaela went to get the scooter, an unidentified white male jumped out of the vehicle and grabbed Michaela, pulling her into his vehicle as she screamed. Her friend witnessed in horror the entire abduction and ran inside the store for help. A female store clerk quickly called 911, but by the time they ran outside, the tan or gold sedan, the unidentified man, and Michaela were gone. Michaela has never been located. I wanted to mention that upon hearing of the abduction of Ilene, the families of both Michaela and Amber drove to Dublin on Tuesday, January 31st to be with the Misheloffs. They wanted to provide comfort, share resources they had found, offer solidarity, and prepare the family for what was to come. I can't fathom the incredible courage and selflessness it takes to find the strength to reach out and support another family while still in the fog of your own tragedy and awaiting your own answers. For all 3 of these families, if you just rewound the clock a year, they all had their little girls with them, and they all lived a completely different life. Almost 3 years after Ilene's abduction, on December 27th, 1991, 4-year-old Amanda Nicole Ilene Campbell was spending the day riding her bike and playing with friends in Fairfield, California. She and her brother had been visiting an address 4 houses down, and she left to go ride her bike to another friend's house, 8 houses down and around the corner from her family's residence. She never arrived. Her bike was found abandoned on a few blocks from her home that evening. A pair of child-sized blue socks were found in the street near her home, but it's unclear if they belonged to Amanda. Police believe she was pulled into a vehicle at the corner of Larchmont Drive and Salisbury Drive in her own neighborhood. Amanda has never been located. As is seen so often when horrifying crimes such as child abductions happen, the small towns in the Tri-Valley area began to exercise more caution. Kids stuck together, parents began to supervise more closely, and the feeling of innocence in their towns faded. What I've told you up to this point about Ilene's case is mostly all we know. The investigation has been cold, but always at the forefront of investigators' minds. There are a few suspects in Ilene's case from that time, and I'll provide a brief overview of each of them. The first is Curtis Dean Anderson. On December 9th, 1999, 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild was walking to school in Vallejo, California when she disappeared. She was last seen talking to a man at a gas station. An extensive search yielded no trace of her. In August of 2000, an 8-year-old girl named Mitzi Sanchez was walking home from school in Vallejo. She was excited to get home that day because it was her birthday party. She knew her mom was already at home getting ready for it. As she was walking home, she noticed a man sitting in his car that gave her a bad vibe, so much so that she crossed the street to be away from him. As she got closer to the car, the man got out and asked her for help getting some duct tape out of his car. As she bent over, he put his hand over her mouth and threw her in the car. She recalled him driving her away and even driving by her house, where she saw her mom preparing for her birthday party. She said she just felt like she wanted to go home so bad in that moment. Mitzi's abductor assaulted her and kept her chained up, driving around with her for over a day and a half, and having her sleep in the vehicle in a truck stop pull-off. She later described, quote, "It was one of those long silver link chains, and he tied it really tight around my leg and locked it up with a padlock. And I thought, this is it. I'm never going to see my family again," end quote. She said he would leave her and cover the car up with blankets and towels on the window so nobody could see in. She said, quote, "He would leave me in the car to go see my mom cry on TV," end quote. 2 days after the kidnapping, he made a crucial error. Leaving Mitzi in the car, he left his key ring there as well. She was able to gain access to it and pick the lock on the chain attached to her leg. She managed to free herself, and she escaped the vehicle just as he was returning, and he saw her running away. He yelled at her to get back in, but she was already free. A few hours later, cab driver Curtis Dean Anderson was apprehended. He was sentenced to 251 years in prison for the abduction of Mitzi. Meanwhile, in 2001, the skull of Ziana Fairchild was recovered from a remote hillside. In 2004, Anderson confessed in jail to the murder of Ziana. He admitted that he lured the young child into his vehicle with quarters, candy, and a promised trip to Disneyland. He also shared that he recorded himself assaulting Ziana. He claimed to have kept her alive in his boarding room for weeks before eventually murdering her. These were all to the jailhouse informant, but during 2 interviews with investigators at Corcoran State Prison in March of 2004, Anderson, while never admitting killing the girl, allegedly confessed to filming his molestation of her and, quote, renting Ziana out, end quote, to other pedophiles for drugs and money. During the course of the next couple of years, Anderson became terminally ill. During this time, in November of 2009, he confessed to murdering 8 victims in the United States and 2 victims in Mexico. Among those, he named Amber Schwartz Garcia. He died in December of 2009. In the case of Amber, according to the Charlie Project, Anderson stated that he just happened to be driving in the neighborhood, saw Amber, and kidnapped her for, quote, company. He stated he sedated her with root beer schnapps and took her to a motel in the Tucson, Arizona area, where he suffocated her about a day and a half after her abduction. He then left the child's body in an isolated area beside Highway 10 in Benson, Arizona. Authorities investigated his confession for 18 months, but couldn't find any information to refute it. Amber's mother, however, is less convinced that he did it. Anderson was known to lie, tease, and mislead police and torture families with misinformation. Her skepticism was so strong that they reopened her case in 2013, and it remains open to this day, hopeful that with forensic evidence at a point, they can find answers one way or another. Anderson operated primarily in the Vallejo area, about 40 miles northwest of Dublin. He was active during this time, though never did mention Ilene's case during any of the times he was bragging about his crimes. Ilene is a bit older than his other victims as well, but it's still entirely possible that he could be responsible. Even though he's deceased, the FBI still has a part of their webpage up that discusses wanting to identify victims that could have been Anderson's, and still asks for tips from the public. The next person I want to mention is David Emery Mish, because I did come across his name repeatedly as another possible suspect. There is even a 2021 article by The Independent that says Dublin police were looking into him. He has been in prison since 1989 for the murder of a woman named Margaret Ball, who was his longtime friend and neighbor. In 2020, while still in prison after multiple parole denials, he was charged with the 1988 murder of Michaela Garrett. When Michaela was abducted that day in November of '88, her scooter was left behind. In 2020, police matched the palm print left behind on the scooter to Mish. Prior to the 2020 connection to Michaela, police had already linked his DNA in 2018 to the unsolved 1986 double homicide of best friends Jennifer Dewey and Michelle Xavier. In looking at his arrest record, he was arrested and charged with drug possession the week of November 21st, 1988, just a few days after the abduction of Michaela. He remained in prison from that time until his parole on November 17th, 1989. He was in prison for almost a full year, including when Ilene was abducted. Of note, he was also in prison for burglary during the abduction of Amber Schwartz Garcia. He was also already serving his homicide sentence by the time Amanda Nikki Campbell was abducted in 1991. He is still awaiting trial for the 3 homicides he has been charged with. So while he's a horrible person, he's not the horrible person responsible for whatever happened to Ilene. The next person I want to talk about is Timothy Binder. And buckle up because there's a lot ahead. There is comprehensive information about Timothy out there, including a whole book by forensic psychologist John Philpin called Stalemate. For pulling a great summary together, I actually heavily referenced a Reddit thread that I'll link in the show notes that pulled together many resources and information to give an overview of Binder and why some consider him a suspect in Ilene's case. The information out there is so comprehensive and such high volume that, again, I really appreciate this source as a valuable tool to kind of summarize it in the easiest way possible. Timothy Binder first came on police's radar in 1991. At that time, he was married, 43 years old, and working for the county sanitation department. He spent a lot of time in cemeteries and volunteered to fix old gravestones. He once also worked at a crematorium. He had engaged in disturbing behavior towards little girls that parents had gone to the police about. For starters, he was sending cards in the mail to Bay Area girls. Some included little trinkets or gifts and handwritten letters. One mother turned over the letters from Binder to police, and one of the letters was written backwards so it could only be read in front of a mirror. He also included Bible verses in some of the notes with special underlined words like, quote, "I have chosen you to be with me where I am," end quote. When he was confronted about this, he stated that he was just trying to befriend these girls and that they were lonely. If you're wondering about how he had access to all of this personal information about these girls, so was I. As it turns out, he has quite the history of data collection. You see, investigators discovered he was terminated in 1985 from his job as Social Security claims processor after he was caught collecting the names, addresses, and birth dates of young girls living in Colorado. He identified 40 young girls whom he sent $50 to on their 14th birthdays. He claimed he was mimicking a TV show where a man surprises strangers with money, and that he was bringing, quote, a touch of magic for the kids, end quote. He was fired from his job, but if you're looking to be filled with rage today, I'm here to provide. He was given his job back less than 2 years later, when an arbitrator found that Binder had not used the information he collected for personal gain, and therefore there was no just cause for his termination. Yeah, seriously. Apparently, personal gain is not okay, but stalking children is. He has inserted himself into the investigations of several missing children, notably 2 I've already mentioned, Michaela Garrick and Amber Schwartz Garcia. He would do things like his own searches for the girls, calling the families to speak to them, sharing his thoughts on what could have happened, and offering his help in any way. He seemed to know that this would put him on the suspect radar, and he would downplay it and just say he was a good Samaritan. The parents said they felt like he was trying to play psychological games with them and actually make them consider that he may be a suspect. The creepy factor doesn't stop there. In fact, to really understand him, you have to back it up to the 1983 abduction of Angela Bugay from Antioch, California. She was 5 years old at the time of her abduction and was later found sexually assaulted and strangled to death. An ex-boyfriend of her mother was tied to her abduction by forensic evidence, and Binder was not considered a suspect in her homicide. However, experts have wondered if her homicide was the tipping point for Binder to escalate from fantasy behavior to criminal behavior. After Binder began visiting her grave repeatedly, the FBI conducted surveillance. He was said to have visited her grave up to 80 times. While under surveillance in the days after the abduction of Amber Schwartz Garcia, Binder visited Angela's grave, kissed it, and simulated a sex act. He told a forensic psychologist that he liked that Angela's picture was on her gravestone, and that he fell in love with her, saying, quote, "You're not supposed to be in love with a dead girl," end quote. What's more is that scent dogs allegedly traced the scent of missing girls Amber Schwartz Garcia and Amanda Nikki Campbell to the gravesite of Angela Bugay. Obviously, anything we conclude from that could be speculation, but the implication is that he was the perpetrator in those abductions, and it's possible he brought the children to her gravestone, before or after their presumed homicides. One thing I thought about with that was that I know he inserted himself into the searches for those girls, so I'm not sure if he had access to any types of articles of clothing or things that would have the girls' scent on them that maybe he brought to Angela's grave. That would be incredibly creepy, but it would make the evidence circumstantial enough that it can't definitively say that he actually brought the girls to the gravestone because he abducted them and did harm to them. In 1988, he mailed a law enforcement letter stating that he felt the next girl who would be abducted would be 9 years old. Shortly after the letter arrived, Michaela Garrick was abducted. He also sent an FBI profiler a card with a hand holding up the number 4 in 1991, shortly before the disappearance of 4-year-old Amanda Nikki Campbell. In 1992, they raided his home, car, and other belongings to look for connections to the missing girls. At the time, he drove a light blue Dodge conversion van with the license plate Love You spelled LUV. The inside of the van was wallpapered with pictures of children, crayon drawings, and Bible verses. Binder seemed to enjoy some of this attention, and he spent countless hours with author and psychologist John Philbin being interviewed. Even stranger, he independently initiated an interview with a local newspaper reporter in which he made all the arrangements. He selected the interview location to be Oakmont Cemetery, where Angela was buried, and he picked the time to be 4:30 a.m. He spoke with Linda Golston from the San Jose Mercury News and asked that he be able to play his favorite song for her. The song? Jesus, Here's Another Child to Hold. He shared with her what he considered to be his true crime expertise on child abductions. He shared how he felt children would react to being abducted, including if they would go along with it or fight back. He would even speculate as to why they were taken and what may have happened to them. He once even suggested that the killer may have disposed of bodies in open graves at Oakmont Cemetery. If you're getting big O.J. Simpson if I did it vibes from this, yeah, me too. But it's unclear to me if they ever investigated that in depth. I mean, how would you even go about it? You can't just disturb a bunch of people's graves and burial sites without having more specific and credible evidence. He has never been charged with any crimes related to child abduction or murder. Quite the opposite, in fact. He sued the Fairfield Police Department for invasion of privacy and defamation in 1997, related to the 1992 raid on his home and subsequent front-page coverage of him as a suspect in Amanda Campbell's abduction. He said that they ruined his life and his reputation. He was awarded $90,000 in a settlement. Many people chalk him up to just being a creep, but I'll quote John Philpin when he said, quote, "This kind of accumulation of coincidence is not anything I've ever encountered in 25 years of investigative work," end quote. So, like Anderson, Binder is absolutely not crossed off the suspect list and a very real possibility. In doing this research, I've seen reference to the possibility of the horrible couple killer, James Delvagio and Michelle Michaud, being involved. Often called the minivan murderers, they were serial sexual predators who abducted young women and girls off the street. They escalated to homicide in 1997 when they murdered 22-year-old Vanessa Sampson. While it's possible that one or the other could have acted alone, from what I've read, this couple didn't even meet each other until 1996, kicking off their reign of terror of devious acts. So, unless I'm missing something obvious, which feel free to let me know, they certainly couldn't have committed the crime together. However, Delvagio was out and living one town over from Dublin in Pleasanton at the time of Ilene's disappearance. He was on parole from the 1986 rape of a woman in Tracy, about 25 minutes east of Dublin. A few sources state that Delvagio's daughter attended Wells Middle School at the same time as Ilene, but I want to note that I personally could not verify that information. Delvagio's criminal charges and pattern align with the possible involvement in Ilene's abduction. He was known to abduct teens and young women in their 20s from outdoor locations and sexually assault them. He is suspected to be a serial killer, though is currently incarcerated on one murder. Like many other suspects I've mentioned, he presumably got away with a lot of crimes which paved the way for him to further harm and kill women. In 1984, a woman in Pleasanton told police that Delvagio tried to sexually assault her, but no charges were filed in that case. In 1985, he was convicted of another sexual assault nearby, but served no prison time. A woman who was abducted and sexually assaulted just a few months prior to Ilene's disappearance later identified Delvagio as her attacker, but the statute of limitations had run out. He was known to force women and girls into his vehicle during the daytime, often in the fall and winter months. 2 of his victims were close to Ilene's age, and some of the later crimes he committed were in very close proximity to where Ilene was seen. After Ilene disappeared, the outdoor abductions and attempted abductions seemingly stopped until he returned to the area with his partner, Michelle Michaud, in 1997. On September 29, 1997, They abducted a 20-year-old college student in Reno, Nevada, off the sidewalk near her home. They forced her into their van, sexually assaulted her, and then released her the next day. In September and October of that year, respectively, they had also abducted a 12-year-old girl and a 13-year-old girl, whom they enacted the same pattern with. Abduction, assault, release. Vanessa's kidnapping and murder occurred while she was walking to her job in Pleasanton on December 2nd, 1997. Her remains were found off Highway 88 near Lake Tahoe. She had been strangled. Michaud and Delvagio were arrested in 1997 for the kidnapping of the woman in Nevada. They were then charged in November of 98 with Vanessa's kidnapping, assault, and murder. They are still serving their death row sentence. And James Delvagio is at San Quentin. So in one possibility, Ilene's case is connected with other younger child abductions in the area, like Amber and Amanda. In another scenario, her case could be connected to the teen and young adult abductions like those committed by James Delvagio. There is also the third possibility that there are far more suspects out there than we've even made a web of connections to in these unsolved cases. With whatever the case may be, the Misheloff family has never been granted any answers to their questions. Her family held a vigil walk for her every single year, starting at her school and mapping her walk home, concluding at St. Raymond's Catholic Church, where a prayer service was then always held. The Misheloffs have left her room exactly as it was on the day of her disappearance. They don't go in her room. Her bag still sits there with her ice skates and water bottle. They have her missing poster on the vehicle and on the front window of their house. Said Maddie, quote, "That's her private world, and it's gonna stay that way until she's here. We have no evidence that she isn't alive. That's the only way I can get through the day. How do you give up on your child? It's not an option," end quote. Maddie never did give up on her daughter's safe return. In April of 2020, she died of cancer. Mike continues to search for his daughter and carry the spirit and resolve of his beloved wife Maddie alongside him in his efforts. He found it too difficult to continue the prayer walk without Maddie. In a 2021 interview, he said he wondered what he'd tell Ilene about her mother if suddenly she turned up alive. His hope in having that outcome is waning given the passage of time. He said he knows realistically she's no longer alive. But he said, quote, "I won't be totally as healed as I would be as long as the case is open and the perpetrator is still around. I think the most important thing is to put him in a place where he can no longer get out and hurt somebody," end quote. Ilene's case has very little evidence, but keeping her name out there may be all the difference in getting answers. James Delvagio was known for bragging about his crimes to acquaintances. Even if he isn't who perpetrated the crime, it's highly possible that whoever is responsible for Ilene's disappearance has said something to someone. If you're one of those people and you've had this on your conscience, now is the time to come forward. Maddie Misheloff went to her grave without having answers, and Mike is now around 80. He and his surviving sons deserve to know what happened to Ilene so they can move towards their next stage in their grief. There is a $100,000 reward being offered in this case. If Ilene were still alive, she would be 49 years old at the time of this recording. She was last seen wearing a charcoal gray pullover esprit sweater, a pink and charcoal gray skirt with horizontal stripes, black low-top ked sneakers, and 2 earrings in each ear. She was carrying a dark blue backpack and a black molded hard plastic flute case. She has brown hair, brown eyes. Ilene wore braces on her teeth at the time of her disappearance. Ilene has freckles on her cheeks and on the bridge of her nose and a small lump on the inside of her left ankle. If you have any information, please contact the Dublin Police Department at 925-833-3333 6670. You can also submit an anonymous tip to the FBI website online. Until next time, this is A Simpler Time, True Crime. Sources can be found in the show notes, and information and pictures referenced in this episode can be found in posts on our Instagram page at Simpler Time Crime Pod. If you liked this episode, please follow and subscribe and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast.